Now this is one of the best, strongest, and fastest shrapnel build in Once Human. With this build you will basically never have to reload and will be able to auto heal when you kill an enemy. Now this is a PvE build and this build is so strong that you can easily destroy groups of enemies and shred any bosses. With this build I focus on crit rate and crit damage for maximum damage. I'll be going over my gear, mods, the Cradle, and Deviant with this build. I will also explain the most effective strategies to achieve the no reload effect during combat, as well as going over the damage rotation for achieving maximum damage. I did farm all legendary mods for this build, and the mods make a huge difference in power. And this is an endgame build that can easily beat any pro bosses and pro silos solo, because this build has high damage and strong survivability. And I recommend you to watch this video from the beginning to the end to see how everything synergizes. So let's check this out. So first I'm going to show you destroying the hardest bosses on pro difficulty. This build is so strong that it will shred any bosses in seconds while never needing to reload. The main weapon for this build is the Scar, the Last Valor, which is a shrapnel weapon obtained from the Wish Machine. And I am also using a legendary armor set that can only be attained from the Wish Machine. Now I focused on damage and also survivability with this build, so you can easily beat any pro silos and pro bosses solo. I could have easily gotten more damage with this build and sacrificed the no reload effect and some survivability, but then you will be more like a glass cannon and will struggle in some scenarios. Now just be aware that just maximizing your damage is not the best when it comes to PvE. You will need to kill normal and elite enemies, and just having pure damage, you will sacrifice survivability, and you don't need tons of damage to kill normal and elite enemies because you don't need to do the max damage rotations against them. And all the bosses but one have invincibility phases, so just purely dealing damage is not as effective. Now if you just plan to only fight the Trent boss, which does not have any invincibility phases, then purely doing damage is fine. But other than that, it will be more beneficial to get some survivability and sacrifice some damage in return. And with this build I have all legendary mods, and you'll need specific stats on your mods to do tons of damage, but I'll go over everything in more details in their dedicated sections. Okay, so next for the gear. Now all my gear is crafted to tier 5 and fully upgraded, maxed in calibration. I have all legendary mods, but I'll go over the mods in another section in this video. So starting with the weapons. Now the primary weapon I'm using is the Scar, the Last Valor assault rifle. And this is one of the best shrapnel weapons in the game, good at all ranges. Now shrapnel is a special ammo effect that deals additional weapon damage when you hit an enemy. You can see the exact details on the screen, which states, upon hitting an enemy with a bullet, deal weapon damage of 50% attack to a random unhit part. The element type is the same as the weapon's element. The additional damage can crit, strike weak spots, and will decay with distance. The actual factor equals 50% times 1 plus shrapnel damage factor bonus times 1 plus shrapnel final damage bonus. Now the Scar, the Last Valor assault rifle, is attained from the Wish Machine, but you can find drop versions of this weapon from bosses. Now this is your main weapon that you'll use most of the time. However, when fighting bosses, you will need to switch weapons to perform the damage rotation to drastically increase your damage. And the weapon feature states 4% chance to trigger shrapnel with a hit. Crit hits count as 2 hits. Crit hits grants shrapnel trigger chance +1 for 1 second, and shrapnel crit damage plus 30%. So this weapon has one of the highest damage when it triggers shrapnel, and crit hits will increase the chance of triggering shrapnel. So building crit rate with this weapon is really powerful. Now for the accessories for this weapon. I'm using the hammer compensator for the muzzle, the tactical holographic sight for the optic, the light front grip for the tactics, the light rifle mag for the magazine, and steel rifle bullets for ammo. And with all these accessories, you're ideally increasing your mobility with this weapon. And all these accessories can be found in the world. And if you're having trouble finding some of these accessories, you can use an interactive map for Once Human online and search for the accessory you're looking for. Next for the calibration for the Scar, the Last Valor assault rifle. I'm using the heavy style calibration with 2 crit rate attributes. Now I have tested different types of calibrations, but you want to use the heavy style calibration that will increase your magazine size, but you will lose some reload speed. Now I have tested the rapid shot style calibration, but having more ammo will let you be able to beat bosses and groups of enemies without needing to reload. Now you will gain more damage using the rapid shot style calibration, but I have noticed that I have to reload more often during combat. While using the heavy style calibration, weapon that will increase your magazine size. You will basically only need to reload after combat or when the bosses are defeated. Okay, so next for the secondary weapon, I'm using the AWS Bingo Sniper Rifle. And when you switch to this weapon will guarantee the bullseye status when you hit an enemy. And what bullseyes does is it highlights marked targets with an outline and suffer vulnerability plus 8% for 12 seconds. And the bullseye status effect will greatly increase your damage to bosses and elite enemies. Now for the accessories for this weapon, I'm using the large break for the muzzle, the large optic sight for the optic, the tactical SR mag for the magazine, and steel rifle bullets for ammo. Now an alternate secondary weapon you can use is the recurve crossbow if you don't have the sniper rifle. But with this weapon you have to hit the weak spot in order to mark targets with the bullseye status, and you'll get crit rate plus 30% on the marked target. Now there are some scenarios where hitting the boss's weak point could be difficult, so using the AWS Bingo Sniper Rifle is more reliable to guarantee the bullseye status. But the sniper rifle can only be attained from the wish machine, while the recurve crossbow can be easily found in the world. And for the melee weapon, I'm using the stun baton, which inflicts targets with power surge. Now I only use the melee weapon when I'm at low level zones where enemies don't do any damage to me, and I can spread power surge because of my mod, so you can easily destroy groups of low level enemies quickly. You can also do a jump attack tech with this weapon to easily speed through areas, and this tech is really good and useful, especially on the Forsaken giant boss, to quickly get to an area where the boss can't hit you, but you can technically use whatever melee weapon you want. Okay, so next for the armor. Now I am using a 4-piece Lone Wolf set as my mask, gloves, top, and bottom. With the 4-piece Lone Wolf set, you will get 1. Magazine capacity 10%, 2. Crit rate 5%, 3. Get 1 stacks of Lone Shadow with every 2 weapon crit hits. Lone Shadow, crit damage plus 6% for 30 seconds. The effect can stack up to 8 times. And 4. Increase max Lone Shadow stacks to 10. Crit rate plus 8% for 2 seconds after reloading. So the 4-piece Lone Wolf set will greatly increase your crit rate and crit damage, and this legendary set can only be attained from the wish machine. Now for the helmet, I'm using the beret, and this will increase the shrapnel hit part plus 1, and this helmet is easily found in the world. Now I have tested both the legendary helmets, and they actually increase your damage and health compared to the beret. However, since the beret increases your shrapnel hit part by plus 1, there is a higher chance of your shrapnel to hit the enemy's weak spot, so you need to use the beret in order to achieve the no reload effect. Now the gas tight helmet will increase your damage more than the cage helmet. However, you won't achieve the no reload effect as reliable with either of these legendary helmets compared to when using the beret. Now this will make more sense when I go over the mods and when I explain the most effective strategies to avoid reloading during combat. And last but not least, for the shoes, I'm using the ballistic boots, and this will increase your weapon damage by 10% when your HP is above 70%, and these boots can only be attained from the wish machine. And because I am using an auto heal mod, my HP is normally over 70%, allowing me to gain the 10% weapon damage boost. Okay, so next for the mods, and all of my mods are legendary mods that are farmed by doing pro bosses for the weapon mods and pro silos for the armor mods. Now the mods are really important that will allow this build to achieve the no reload effect and gain the ability to auto heal when you kill an enemy. Now the mods attribute effects are very important to greatly increase your damage. The attributes you're looking for in order of importance are crit damage, weapon damage, damage against great ones, and either reload speed bonus or magazine capacity. Now with this build, you don't want to get any attribute effects that increases your weak spot damage, because you will be using a mod that will remove your weak spot damage, but in return this mod will greatly increase your crit rate and crit damage. So first for the weapon mods. So for the Scar, the Last Valor assault rifle, the mod I'm using is the Shrapnel Souvenir Violent Weapon mod, and this states when shrapnel hits a weak spot, automatically refills 1 bullet from inventory. And for the attribute effects, I have crit damage, weapon damage, head damage reduction, and damage against elite enemies. And this mod is very important in order to achieve the no reload effect, because when your shrapnels hit a weak spot, you will automatically refill 1 bullet from your inventory. And there's an armor mod that I will go over that will increase your chance of your shrapnels to hit the enemy's weak point. Now for the AWS Bingo Sniper Rifle, I'm using the Vulnerability Amplifier Violent Weapon mod, which states the bullseyes adds vulnerability plus 8%, and the attribute effects I have is crit damage, damage against great ones, magazine capacity, and head damage reduction. So this mod will increase your damage to enemies that are affected by the bullseyes status. And for the stun baton, I'm using the shock diffusion violent weapon mod, which states when triggering power surge, apply the power surge status to one enemy within 5 meters of the target. Prioritize enemies that are not affected by power surge status. And for the attribute effects, I have crit damage, weapon damage reduction, damage against normal enemies, and damage against elite enemies. And this mod is really good to easily destroy groups of low level enemies. And I do want to mention for the weapon mods, the mods only take effect when you equip the weapon. So the mods on your secondary weapon and melee weapon won't take effect and increase your stats if you are using your primary weapon. Okay, so next for the armor mods. So for the helmet, I'm using the Fateful Strike Violent Armor mod, and this states cannot deal weak spot damage, crit rate plus 10%, and crit damage plus 30%. And for the attribute effects, I have crit damage, weapon damage, damage against great ones, and max HP. Now this mod will greatly increase your crit rate and crit damage, but in return you will not be able to deal any additional damage when hitting the enemy's weak spot. So this is the reason you don't want to get any attribute effects that increases your weak spot damage. Next for the top piece, I'm using the Rejuvenating Violent Armor mod, which states when HP is above 60%, a kill recovers 15% lost HP. And for the attribute effects, I have crit damage, damage against normal enemies, reload speed bonus, and max HP. So this mod will auto heal you when you kill an enemy. And this mod is really good for survivability, especially during boss fights and not needing to use tons of activators or heals. And this mod pairs really good with the ballistic boots because the ballistic boots will increase your damage when your HP is above 70%. Next for the bottom piece, I'm using the Deadshot Violent Armor mod, which states each crit hit by non-melee weapons grants plus 5 crit damage up to 45%. The effect is removed upon the next reload. And for the attribute effects, I have crit damage, weapon damage, damage against elite enemies, and reload speed bonus. And this mod will greatly increase your crit damage. And next for the shoes, I'm using the Covered Advanced Violent Armor mod, which states taking no damage within 4 seconds grants plus 20% melee, weapon, and status damage for 30 seconds. The effect resets when the duration ends. And for the attribute effects, I have crit damage, weapon damage reduction, damage against elite enemies, and damage against normal enemies. And this mod will greatly increase your damage when taking no damage within 4 seconds. And because of your Deviant, the Lone Wolf Deviant, which draws nearby enemies aggro, it's very easy to activate this mod because if the enemies are targeting and damaging you, you can summon the Lone Wolf Deviant to make the enemies change targets and not be damaging you. And next for the gloves, I'm using the Crit Amplifier Violent Armor mod, which states crit rate plus 10%, crit damage plus 15%. And for the attribute effects, I have crit damage, damage against great ones, damage against normal enemies, and head damage reduction. And this mod will greatly increase your crit rate and crit damage. And last but not least, for the mask, I'm using the Shrapnel Carnage Violent Armor mod, and this states Shrapnel weak spot hit weight plus 100%, Shrapnel weak spot damage plus 25%. And for the attribute effects, I have crit damage, damage against great ones, status damage reduction, and damage against normal enemies. And this mod is very important for increasing the chance of your Shrapnels to hit the enemy's weak spot. So you want to pair this mod with the Shrapnel Souvenir Weapon mod so that when your Shrapnels hit the enemy's weak spot, you will automatically refill 1 bullet from your inventory. In having both these mods, you can easily achieve the no reload effect with this build. Okay, so with all these legendary mods and the right attribute effects, you will greatly increase your damage, achieve the no reload effect, gain the ability to auto heal when killing enemies, and easily clear any content in the game. Okay, so next for the Cradles. Now the Cradles will greatly enhance your abilities, and I focused on damage and survivability for this build. So the first Cradle I'm using is the Automatic Weapon Enhancement, and this states damage plus 20% when holding SMGs, rifles, or LMGs. Reload 10% of magazine capacity from reserve upon defeating an enemy. So this Cradle will greatly increase your assault rifle's damage. The next Cradle I'm using is Master Tactician, and this states after using a tactical item, damage against the great ones, bosses, plus 25% for 15 seconds. And this Cradle will greatly increase your damage against bosses after using a tactical item. And the tactical item I'm personally using is the throwing knife, but you can also use grenades or molotovs. The next Cradle I'm using is Deviation Master, and this states having it fight alongside grants damage plus 50% against Deviants. And this Cradle will greatly increase your damage when you have your Deviant summoned. The next Cradle I'm using is Rapid Aid, and this states reduce the cooldown of healing items by 30% and increase the healing effect by 15%. So this Cradle cradle is really good for healing and survivability. And the next cradle I'm using is tactical combo, and this states weapon damage plus 25% for 4 seconds after switching weapons or reloading. And this cradle will greatly increase your damage after reloading or switching weapons. The next cradle I'm using is sprint, and this states movement speed plus 5%, running stamina cost minus 15%. And this cradle is really good for mobility, allowing you to easily dodge attacks. And the next cradle I'm using is deadly combo, and this states after hitting a weak spot with bullet effects, bounce and shrapnel, bullet effect damage plus 25% for 3 seconds. And this cradle will greatly increase your damage when your shrapnel hits a weak spot. And the last cradle I'm using is bullet hunt, and this states after killing a target with ranged weapons, shrapnel damage plus 25%, shrapnel crit damage plus 35% for 15 seconds. And this cradle will greatly increase your shrapnel's damage and shrapnel's crit damage after killing an enemy. Okay, so with all these cradles, you'll greatly increase your damage and survivability to easily clear any content in the game. Okay, so next for the Deviant. Now I'm using the Lone Wolf Deviant. The Lone Wolf Deviant is one of the best Deviants in the game because the Lone Wolf Deviant will attack enemies and will also draw aggro from nearby enemies, allowing you to not be targeted by enemies and take damage. The Lone Wolf Deviant will also greatly increase your weapons damage, making you really powerful. And this Deviant pairs really good with the covered advanced violent armor mod because the Lone Wolf Deviant will draw the enemy's aggro, allowing you to not take damage. And this mod will greatly increase your damage when not taking damage after 4 seconds. And I also have tested all the other Deviants, and some of the other Deviants are pretty good, but the Lone Wolf Deviant's ability to aggro the enemy is really powerful for survivability. I have also tested the Festering Gel Deviant, and this was one of the best Deviants for survivability in the early days, but the Festering Gel Deviant was greatly nerfed and is not that good anymore. So overall, the Lone Wolf Deviant is the best Deviant to use with this build for damage and survivability. Okay, so next I'll explain the most effective strategy to achieve the no reload effect during combat. Now with this build, you want to shoot any part of the enemy but the enemy's weak spot. You don't want to shoot the weak spot because you want your shrapnels to hit the weak spot. Because if you hit the weak spot of the enemy, then the shrapnel will hit another part of the enemy and will not hit the weak spot you hit. And because of one of your mods, the Fateful Strike Violent Armor mod, you lose weak spot damage anyway. So hitting the weak spot won't increase your damage. And because of your weapon mod, the Shrapnel Souvenir Violent Weapon mod, you will automatically refill 1 bullet from your inventory when your shrapnels hit the enemy's weak spot. So this is how you achieve the no reload effect during combat. And last but not least, for the damage rotation. Now when fighting bosses, you want to use your Lone Wolf Deviant, and then you want to switch your weapon to the AWS Bingo Sniper Rifle to apply the bullseye status to the boss. Then you want to switch back to your Scar, the Last Valor Assault Rifle, and use your tactical weapon. So I'm using the throwing knife as my tactical weapon, and then just start unloading with the assault rifle. So by doing this damage rotation, you will gain damage from all your abilities and achieve maximum damage. So this is ideally how to maximize your damage to bosses with this build. And really quickly for the food, you can easily craft canned meat, which will increase your shrapnel damage by 20%. Now to craft the canned meat, all you need is any type of meat, salt, and aluminum, which is very easy to obtain. And this food will greatly increase your shrapnel's damage. Okay, so thanks for checking out one of the best, strongest, and fastest shrapnel build in Once Human. This build is a powerful PvE build that can easily destroy groups of enemies and shred any bosses. With this build, you will basically have to never reload and will be able to auto heal when you kill an enemy. This build focuses on crit rate and crit damage to easily clear any content in the game. Hope this helps in more videos to come, so stay tuned and go out there and discover the unknown in Once Human.